secretary of the political party Socialist Action. And today we are having an exchange with an old friend and the author of a new book, The Tragedy of American Science, Cliff Connor. Let me say a few things about Cliff. Not too long ago, he authored a book called Jean-Paul Marat, Scientist and Revolutionary, which is now translated into French and was one of my favorite books. And when I spoke to my old friend, high school and college classmate Stephen Jay Gould, who is perhaps the world's leading evolutionary biologist, what he thought of Jean-Paul Marat, Scientist and Revolutionary, Gould's response, without having read the book, was, well, Marat was sort of an obscure figure in the French Revolution of 1789 and even more obscure in the scientific community. I'm sorry he didn't stay around with us long enough to read Cliff's book, because he, like with his other books, brought Jean-Paul Marat's Science and Politics out of obscurity to explain the extremely important role he played. Cliff is also the author of The People's History of Science. When I ran around local bookstores, I was up in Northern California, stopped in a bookstore. There was The People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn and The People's History of Science by Cliff Connor, side by side. In fact, they're related. It was Howard who wrote a blurb for Cliff's book, Howard Zinn, The People's History of Science. And now Cliff comes up with a new book by Haymarket Press entitled The Tragedy of American Science. I have to say one more thing about this tragedy of American science. Yesterday, I was looking at the business section on the projections and advice that stock market experts gave to people who want to make a profit out of investing in a vaccine for COVID-19. And lo and behold, this expert in making money in the stock market said that the worst variant for us stock market experts would be if 5 corporations simultaneously came up with an effective cure. That would depress the value of any vaccine to levels that are near worthless to invest in. My gosh, says this financial analyst, in our society, the greatest cure means the least profits. Whereas in the alternative, he said, hopefully one corporation would come up with a partially effective vaccine, not fully effective, because then you couldn't have second versions and improved versions or other ways to make money. So in a very short summary, Cliff Connor's book, The Tragedy of American Science, exposes the fundamental contradictions of science conducted in the realm of profit as opposed to the service of human needs. Cliff, could you explain more about why you chose that title and perhaps how it relates to today's COVID-19 crisis?
Okay, sure. Jeff, it's good to see you. And I should tell you, I'm a supporter of your campaign. Congratulations on your brilliant campaign for president.
Well, thank you.
You ask about my book, the title of which is The Tragedy of American Science, From Truman to Trump. Well, I'm a historian of science, and that forces me to pay more attention to what's going on in the realm of science that might otherwise be the case. So it's been obvious to me for a long time that something's really been rotten about the way science has been practiced and used and discussed, not only in this country, but especially in this country. And I'd see books written about it with titles like The Republican War on Science, and more recently, Trump's War on Science. And I thought, well, what all of these writers are saying is true, but there's got to be a lot more to it than that. So I started looking at the problem in more depth, and especially historically. When and where did this begin? And I wound up writing this new book to try to answer all those questions. I didn't title the book The Tragedy of Republican Science or The Tragedy of Trump Science, because that misses the real essence of, of what's going on. Just consider the whole problem of climate change denial. It's been going on for decades, at least since the 1980s, and that's a long, long time before Trump came on the scene. And as for the Republicans, yes, the loudest and most obnoxious of the anti-science demagogues have been from the Republican side of the aisle. But the political enemies of science include Democrats as well, because the anti-science campaigns are funded by bipartisan corporate money. And that takes us to one of the two primary sources of the tragedy, the corporatization or privatization of science. The classical ideal of science is that it's supposed to be unbiased investigation, but corporate laboratories are constitutionally incapable of performing disinterested research. They always have an axe to grind. They use scientific techniques to search for evidence to support the claims of their public relations departments. You've heard the phrase science in the public interest. The opposite of that is science in the private interest, which to me is an oxymoron, a pure contradiction in terms. As far as I'm concerned, any science done in the private interest doesn't deserve to be called science at all. And that includes all of the research done directly by corporations or funded by corporations, which is to say the vast majority of research done in the United States today. If anybody insists on calling that science, I insist on adding the adjective corrupt. It's corrupt science, corrupted in order to drive economic inequality. If most of the research in the United States is devoted to increasing corporate profits, which it is, that's what I mean when I say that science has been corrupted to drive economic inequality. There are plenty of outrageous examples. First, we had the decades of so-called tobacco science that aimed to prove that cigarettes don't cause cancer and nicotine is not addictive. That false science was responsible for millions of unnecessary deaths all over the world. And more recently, there was a scandal of pain management science that was corrupted to favor the marketing of addictive opioids that have killed hundreds of thousands of people. And of course, there's the utter absurdity of the scientific pretensions of climate change denial, which threatens the very existence of the human race. Now, all of this has been amplified and taken to absurd extremes by the current crisis, the pandemic. We can talk more about the pandemic in greater detail in a while, but for now, I'm going to get back to the other general theme of the book. I said that corporatization of science is one of the two sources of the tragedy. The other one is the militarization of science, and that's the focus of the second half of the book. Let me quote a line directly from the book. Science and technology, rather than being the creative engines of human progress, have instead been reoriented toward destructive and anti-human ends. And I have to say that in my opinion, this is the most tragic aspect of American science. Most of us expect, or at least hope, that our scientific institutions will devote their efforts to producing knowledge that will benefit the human race. But unfortunately, the trillions of dollars the American government spends in the name of science are primarily devoted to perfecting military technologies of death, finding new and better ways, more efficient ways to kill people in large numbers, from thermonuclear bombs to robot drones to cluster munitions and anti-personnel weaponry of infinite variety. At a budget hearing a few years ago, former so-called Defense Secretary James Mattis gave an unusually frank answer when he was asked why the military needs all of this money, and he's here asking even for more. And his answer was, I need to make the military more lethal. It may sound exaggerated, but when I say trillions of dollars are devoted to military research, that's based on official government accounting that greatly understates the real size of the expenditures. And I also cite evidence in the book to back up the claim that more than half of the annual federal science budget of the United States goes to the military. Last year in 2019, the Republican-controlled Senate and the Democrats in the House of Representatives agreed that the 2020 federal budget would include $738 billion for the military. But that $730 billion figure doesn't include all military spending. The cost of past wars should also be counted. So should the budgets of the Homeland Security Department, NASA, and other militarized agencies. If you add all that in, the military share of the budget rises from half to 2/3 and the absolute amount that they want to spend on war this year doubles from 738 billion to about $1.25 trillion. There are a few progressive Democrats like Bernie Sanders saying, wait a minute, $738 billion is too much to give to the Pentagon. Let's cut that by 10%. Even that's unlikely to happen, but even if it does, 10% is a drop in the bucket, and the military share of the budget will still be absurdly and obscenely immense. Okay, I've been talking a little too long here, but let me just end by saying that in the book, I also try to provide an answer as to how the tragedy of American science might be resolved. First, I cite the positive example of how a small post-capitalist country has been able to advance to the forefront of international science. I'm talking about Cuba, of course. Cuba's achievement in the biomedical sciences certainly provide hope for the rest of the world. If Cuban science has done so much with such little resources, what marvels could the mighty engine of American science achieve? That's another way of asking, what could American science accomplish if it served the public interest instead of serving only private corporate interests? What if we had a science for human needs rather than a science for profits? To accomplish that would require a different kind of political and economic structure than what we have now. The first steps would be to nationalize big pharma, nationalize the fossil fuel industries, nationalize the banks, nationalize the insurance companies, and nationalize the military contractors. But for that to happen, and for it to have any meaning, the nationalized economy has to be administered by a government that's democratically controlled by the people of the country, you and me and all the rest of us, rather than by a tiny super wealthy elite. And that's what's called socialism. Okay, Jeff, you're up.
Thanks, Cliff. I can't help but comment on your final comment that the country is controlled by a super wealthy elite. I just came across a statistic from Forbes magazine that said that the Republicans' Trump candidacy is funded by 99 billionaires. Not to be outdone, Joe Biden and the Democrats are funded by 131 billionaires. Those are the people that really run the country. I think the contradiction that you point to between science for the people in the public interest and science for profit is glaringly stated in this fight over so-called intellectual property rights, which we might call patents. Under capitalism, if someone comes up with a new invention, something advances the interest, they file a patent, which basically bans everybody else from using it. The Trump administration today accuses China, for example, of continually stealing its intellectual property rights. That is, the Trump administration doesn't like the idea that the Chinese would convert primitive factories where most of the work is done by hand labor to automated computerized factories that can produce quality products that compete with American products on the world market. They would like and insist that China refrain from, quote, copying or stealing their intellectual property rights in order to keep China as a non-competitor in world markets. So the United States embargoes or imposes taxes on China for using modern technology, which it calls stealing intellectual property rights. So, for example, if I were to sneak into Pfizer's headquarters, and by the way, as a youngster, I worked for Pfizer in Brooklyn, where its national headquarters was. And if I were to steal the secret to the vaccine that obliterates COVID-19, I would and publish it to the entire world, I'd go to jail for that because I would be stealing intellectual property rights. It's the same thing that we see with Trump's warp speed project, where the government invests literally billions of dollars, and the few companies that receive the government money have their executives immediately granting themselves multi-million, if not billions of dollars of awards based on research that they haven't done, based on products that they haven't developed. But the fact that the government's warp speed is promising to fund them at this point without any results whatsoever. In the world I look at, science would be an internationally collective effort where the gains of every scientist would be immediately known to every other scientist. So they wouldn't have to duplicate the effort, duplicate the tests, but they would have confidence that everyone is trying to solve the same problem, and they would share every achievement in the scientific world, every discovery about RNA factors that enter into cures and all the other things, and we would save unbelievable hours and duplication of efforts and qualitatively advance the cause of humanity. It seems to me that that's the basic theme of your book, to challenge this intellectual property right, capitalist first for profit, Trump's warp speed funding of a precious few. What's your take on that?
I'll try to unpack those questions. And I am in complete agreement with your general outline of what you said about them. Okay, the COVID-19 pandemic represents a new stage in the tragedy of American science. The tragedy's been elevated onto an even higher plane. I was talking earlier about the so-called science wars in the United States, the public disputes over science policy. Well, those battles have become sharper and fiercer since the onset of the pandemic. On the one hand, we have the moronic pronouncements of an administration that obviously couldn't care less about human lives other than their own, and couldn't give less of a damn about public health. And on the other hand are the actual scientists, the epidemiologists, the infectious disease experts, the public health experts, some of whom have attained heroic status in the eyes of a large section of the general public. The most prominent example is the now famous Dr. Fauci. But at the same time, especially on the local level, many public health officials are reporting that they've been harassed with death threats from Trump's right-wing lumpen base. So that's a stark indicator of how much more serious and bitter the science wars have become in the COVID era. I'm not going to say much about the absurd and pathetic actions and inaction of the Trump administration. I'm sure everybody's aware by now of how they dismantled all the early warning systems that could have alerted the country and the world well in advance of the threat. And I'm sure you're also aware of how they've weakened the federal regulatory agencies charged with oversight of scientific affairs, the CDC, the EPA, and the FDA, and others, first by slashing their budgets, and now by manipulating them for their own partisan political advantage. But I do want to comment on those important issues that Jeff has alluded to. First is the issue of how collaboration among scientists around the world has been replaced by extreme secrecy in the name of intellectual property rights. At the moment, this problem is very relevant, as we all know, to the quest for a COVID-19 vaccine. The secrecy is a consequence, The secrecy is a consequence of the corporatization or privatization of science that I discussed earlier. It proceeds from the whole notion of business secrecy. Jeff said he worked for Pfizer when he was younger. My first job out of college gave me a first-hand lesson in business secrecy. I was working for a military contractor of all things, Lockheed Aircraft, and I was required to get a security clearance. In the process of that, they showed me a training film, and the training film explained very carefully, they weren't really worried about Russian spies. They were much more worried about Boeing and McDonnell Douglas, their competitors, stealing their secrets. And I suspect a lot of that's true today when Trump bleats about the Chinese trying to hack into American vaccine research. You can discount everything he says 100%. So whether China is actually trying to steal American scientific knowledge or not, and if they were, I wouldn't necessarily condemn them for it. But the real concern of the big pharma companies who are milking the federal cash cow for billions of dollars is that their big pharma competitors might steal their secrets. I think Jeff's anecdote about the article he read in the Business News today goes along those same lines. For a couple of centuries, so-called intellectual property rights have been enshrined, as Jeff said, in legal systems in the form of patent laws. At first, they actually played a necessary role in the development of capitalism, but in the current era of capitalist decline, they've become a major hindrance to scientific progress. The current patent system stifles the ability of scientists to share their research findings with their colleagues and allows corporations to claim ownership of scientific knowledge that should be publicly owned. It's especially ironic in light of Trump's nonstop jabbering about Chinese violations of intellectual property rights that earlier this year it was Chinese scientists who deciphered the COVID-19 pathogen's genetic code and immediately published it for every researcher in the world to see and use. That's international science at its best. And at the beginning of April, the New York Times reported this. I'll read what it said. While political leaders have locked their borders, scientists have been shattering theirs, creating a global collaboration unlike any in history. Never before, researchers say, have so many experts in so many countries focused simultaneously on a single topic and with such urgency. But what do we have? The Trump administration has been exceptionally resistant to the idea that sharing research findings could speed the way to a creation of a vaccine. A group of 170 countries have joined together in a joint effort called COVAX, C-O-V-A-X, which is a project to develop, manufacture, and distribute a COVID-19 vaccine. Germany, Japan, the European Union are all part of this project. And 2 days ago, the White House announced that it would not join the group. This was another stark reminder of how uniquely tragic American science has become. And Jeff mentioned Trump's so-called warp speed project to create a vaccine, which has created a big pharma scramble for billions of dollars in federal funds. In the first place, trying to produce a vaccine at warp speed is a terrible gamble with public health. If none of the inadequately tested trial vaccines kill anybody, or if one of them should actually prove successful, it would just be a matter of dumb luck. And dumb luck is never a good plan in a deadly crisis. Meanwhile, warp speed is allowing big pharma to rake in billions of our tax dollars, as Jeff pointed out. Why should that be? Why doesn't the federal government assign this research project directly to federal laboratories? If it's a wartime emergency, like they keep telling us, why don't they do what the United States did in World War II with the Manhattan Project and bypass the investors who own the big pharma corporations entirely? Well, the answer to that's pretty obvious, isn't it? the investors who own the big pharma corporations also own the Trump administration. One reason warp speed research may have seemed necessary, by the way, was the chronic lack of preparedness caused by the fact that big pharma has long been resistant to investing in antiviral research because it's not profitable enough for them. It doesn't motivate them. They talk about the profit motive. Well, antiviral research isn't enough of a profit motive for big pharma unless Trump gives them billions in this warp speed project. Big pharma prefers to invest their resources in the big moneymaker drugs like Viagra. I want to conclude by saying something about the economic fallout from the pandemic, which could well be the most tragic aspect of all, even more tragic than the hundreds of thousands of confirmed COVID-19 deaths already. The rapid collapse of large segments of the economy that we're currently witnessing demonstrates the instability and unreliability of our current system of production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services. Tens of millions of workers suddenly found themselves thrown out of their jobs. As a result, it's expected that millions of them will be unable to pay their rent and will be evicted from their homes. And vast numbers of businesses, mostly small businesses, have been forced to shut down their operations. This all adds up to an economic catastrophe on a scale not seen since the Great Depression of the 1930s. As for the response to this crisis, after decades of austerity and cutbacks to essential services, what did we see when the economy began to shut down? It wasn't private enterprise that came up with trillions of dollars to ease the suffering of the unemployed workers or small business owners. It could only come from the federal government. And while the first multi-trillion-dollar bailout did temporarily provide some relief to unemployed workers, the funds were channeled through the largest banks, which made sure the wealthiest financial institutions would profit from this crisis. And way too much of the money was not sent directly to the workers themselves, but to their employers in exchange for promises not to lay off more workers. Anyway, the first amount, the first bailout was nominally $3 trillion, and that wasn't enough. So now it should be obvious it's going to take at least another $3 trillion just to keep the economy temporarily afloat. And we have to wonder, how many more trillions of federal dollars will it take to restabilize the American economy and ensure its survival, which is to say our survival? Nobody knows, but everybody knows that this is a meltdown of unprecedented proportions, and it's revealed a fatal weakness, a fatal flaw in our economic system. And if our whole economy goes belly up, we all die. It's that serious. Will the American and global economies recover, at least partially, when the pandemic subsides? Nobody can predict that with any precision. But the general prognosis is obvious. Many of the tens of millions of laid-off workers may never get their jobs back. And small businesses are going to fail in large numbers, which means that the fruits of any recovery, no matter how partial, will mostly go to the large corporate entities. And all of this can only further exacerbate the already intolerable level of worldwide economic inequality. It's notorious, and I think Jeff was alluding to this, that the world's richest individual, Jeff Bezos, has seen his wealth increase by tens of billions of dollars in the past 6 months. So even if the economy survives the initial COVID-19 shock, will it be able to prepare for future waves of COVID-19 and future novel pathogens? It seems unlikely because the precautionary measures that have to be taken go against the grain of corporate profitability. Corporate hospitals have made it clear that they will not provide the excess capacity necessary to prepare for major emergencies. I suspect that the system's limitations have only begun to be exposed. This all puts us in an extremely dangerous moment. We can't discount the parallels with Weimar Germany. A terminal economic meltdown could produce the kind of social insanity that allowed the Nazis to gain control of one of the most scientifically advanced societies on earth. Our only hope to avoid that is expressed in a familiar line from a familiar poem. We are many, they are few. But we, the many, have to be a lot better organized than we are now to confront the forces of deliberate chaos.
Thanks, Cliff. I appreciate that. I'll just add a couple of contradictions that plague American society. First, why does half the federal budget go to military? You gave one of the reasons, but the other is it's the most highly monopolized industry in the United States. So much so that these monopolies can set prices. For example, take a guess on how much the private military corporations charge for a toilet seat on an atomic submarine. Just one toilet seat runs to $10,000. I'd love to go into the toilet seat business if that's the case. But of course, if you are a monopoly, you can charge whatever you want. Or as one Boeing executive once said, there is no correspondence whatsoever between the cost of production of our military jet planes and what we sell it to the government. And they come up with all kinds of reasons for their high prices, like the pharmaceutical industries do for their high prices, basically saying that they put a lot of time and energy into research. But the fact that military is profitable simply means that the giant rich will invest heavily in it because they have a guaranteed return from the government. It's the same thing with the monopolization of the pharmaceutical industries. The small guy doesn't get a chance, doesn't get the funding from the government. And the large companies tend to monopolize and otherwise manipulate to maximize their profits. Like Pfizer, for example, offshored their national headquarters to, I don't know what country it was, England or so, simply to avoid paying taxes. They put their profits in tax havens like Apple Computer. And the government recently passed legislation allowing Apple to repatriate $280 billion without paying taxes on it, simply by the stroke of a legislator's pen signed by the president. This whole system is unbelievable. So much so that today, as we speak, in the front pages of the New York Times, there is an article on the negotiations between the teachers union in New York City and the mayor, de Blasio. The teachers threatened to strike. And de Blasio said, you can't strike in New York, it's illegal. We'll impose the Taylor law on you. We could put your leadership in prison and fine the teachers overtime in reverse. That is, if you strike in New York against the Taylor law, every teacher is fined or can be fined double time. That is twice the day, twice the amount you would have earned, you owe the city. Well, the teachers said, we don't want to go back to school because the conditions are deadly. There's no protection, no guarantee of masks, no testing, no nurses, no ventilation systems, and all the other stuff. And sadly, it looks like the leadership of the AFT, United Federation of Teachers, signed a contract or an agreement to return to school 1.1 million youngsters of all ages, at least part of them, will return to school in a potentially deadly environment. In an environment that should and must bring on a second wave. That's why New York City is the only major school district in the country to reopen. They want to reopen in order to have women, in general, provide childcare for the kids so they can have the rest of the family go back to work and make profits for the capitalist class. These are just examples of all of you been mentioning. But here I want to get into a critical question. COVID-19 appears to be an accident in history. It appears that it came out of nowhere, and therefore we are in a mad race to find a cure, a vaccine to stop it. But is that the case? Rob Wallace's new book states otherwise. I think his book is called something like Big Pharma equals Big Flu, or something to that effect, where he explains the origin of these viruses, not just COVID-19, but H1N1 and a whole series of bird viruses, pig viruses, and others that are a product of the system of production in agriculture itself, the destruction of the natural environment. Tell us more about whether Rob Wallace is on the ball, because if he is, we're threatened not only with this momentary COVID-19, but with innumerable deadly viruses to come in the future that threaten all of us.
Yeah, by the way, I meant to tell you that I saw your webinar a couple of months ago with Rob Wallace, and I thought it was excellent. I was very happy that you gave him that platform. Rob Wallace's book, as you said, was entitled Big Farms Make Big Flu. And his point was that these novel coronaviruses and novel pathogens of all kinds are an inevitable byproduct of agribusiness, the giant factory farms that that have popped up all over the world. The average size of a chicken farm before World War II was about 50 or 100 chickens. And now there are 30,000, 40,000, 50,000. And you've seen pictures of how these chickens are jammed into warehouses. Those chickens get sick, and they pump them full of antibiotics. But they still continue to generate these novel viruses that can affect us. Not all of them do, just a small percentage, but it doesn't take much to nowadays, as Rob Wallace explains, to hop on the truck and get to the city. And, pretty soon somebody in the city takes a plane to New York, and then we've all got it. So the point he was trying to make is that this novel coronavirus that we call COVID-19, we didn't start worrying about it until it became a problem. It's like the old leaky roof syndrome, where you don't fix the roof until it starts raining. And he says we can't do that. We have to start figuring out a way to prevent these things from happening before they become an emergency. And they were predicted, as you know. And the very agencies that were predicting them were the ones that the White House was shutting down 3 and 4, when Trump first came into office 2 or 3 years ago. So, yeah, it's a real danger that another novel coronavirus or a virus of another kind that creates a worse pandemic than this one could come along. There could be one that could collapse the economy so thoroughly that it would almost be like an exchange of nuclear bombs and nuclear winter that destroys the world economy so thoroughly that if the human race isn't ended, it would certainly go back a few million years to where we began. So it's an extreme danger that we face. It's what I call the third of the anthropogenic existential crises. The first one was the threat of nuclear exchange, which could end the world. The second one is that we learned about more recently is climate change. Global warming could make the world uninhabitable. And the third existential crisis could be what they call a perfect storm pandemic. We haven't seen that yet, and we hope we never do. And the way to prevent that would be to have a government that could impose controls on agribusiness that would prevent them from developing the conditions from which these novel pandemics generate as their natural byproduct. By the way, Jeff, that's all I'll say on that. But you were talking about why the United States spends these absolutely insane amounts of money. People don't stop and think about what $1 trillion is. You can't imagine $1 trillion. And we're spending $1 trillion. For the last 10 years, we spent more than $1 trillion every year, even though they say it now it's 738. Now it's going to be $1.25 trillion this year if they get what they want, and they almost surely will. But there's another explanation as well that I go into in my book. You probably heard the phrase weaponized Keynesianism. And so I can't get into that now, but basically what it means is that without the $1 trillion+ a year in military spending, the unemployment rate in the United States would rise to the sky. The economy would freeze up and go into permanent paralysis. And that's the reason why, oddly enough, only the right-wing Republicans talk about this. The Democrats don't want to mention it because it's true, but it's insolvable within the capitalist system. So anyway, I'll leave that for readers of the book to get into and argue with me if they want to.
Thanks, Cliff. By the way, spending a good many years in laboratories, is that instrument that you just drank out of called the Moore beaker?
Oh, maybe it is, but I don't know. I just use it as a drinking glass.
Right.
You know the old saying, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, right?
Right. I remember Erlenmeyer flasks and Moore beakers because I was assigned to watch them out for the scientists when I was a youngster. You're right. In every instance, the question is the subordination of human needs under capitalism, the profits. That's what the military is about. Even with this latest pandemic, it's amazing to state that if you add the CARES bill bailout of some $3 trillion to the money gifted to the corporations in various forms of loans by the Federal Reserve, you have a total of $6 trillion in that quarter, which is the same amount of the total GDP lost by US corporations. Here you have the government and its control of the economy, which basically is amassed by taxing working people, giving back to the corporate elite virtually every penny that they lost. One of our comrades, Nick Baker, just submitted an article that appears in today's Counterpunch, which details the corporate giveaway in unprecedented clarity. It's the top article in today's Counterpunch. Look for it by Nick Baker, the editor of our newspaper. But the subordination of everything to profits is key. It's the way it works in the pharmaceutical industry, in the military industry, and in every capitalist productive enterprise where scientific advancement, technology that is safe and clean, and automation that could lessen the burden of working an 8-hour day is used to lay off people. And that is, technology means massive layoffs. Today, you said the unemployment figure would be astronomical if the military ended. The government hides the real figures on unemployment. They say the unemployment rate is something like 10.2 or 12.2% maximum, which is the highest recorded unemployment rate since the Great Depression. In the Great Depression, of course, counting the partially unemployed, part-time unemployed, it was 25%. But today, the government's own labor participation rate is almost 50% of eligible workers don't have a job. That's because they have ways of fudging the figures to not include people who are gig economy, low wage, part-time working one quarter are otherwise statistically eliminated for the government's figures. In reality, virtually half of the population of the United States, close to that, doesn't have a job. And that's the crisis. And the United States says, that's fine with us. We'll replace them with machines or with speed up or with wage cuts. California, the governor has cut the wages of public employees by 10%, of state employees by 10%. In New York City, they're trying to force teachers back to school in order to provide childcare so the rest of the working class can work at corporations. 40% of those people laid off are not expected to ever get their jobs back. In other words, what you describe in your wonderful book, The Tragedy of American Science, holds true with virtually every endeavor. Every productive, every aspect of the economy is subordinated to the needs of the few. Cliff, I want to thank you so much. If you have some closing remarks, I wish you luck with your Haymarket book, The Tragedy of American Science. Check into Cliff's The People's History of Science and Jean-Paul Marat, Scientist and Revolutionary, among others of his works. I appreciate your participation. I'll give you the last word before we sign off.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. It's been enjoyable talking to you. I have a number of things I could say, but they would take off into another long discussion. So I'll just hold it for another time. How's that? Thanks again for inviting me to have this conversation with you.
My pleasure. Check us out at socialistaction.org on our website. This remark has been, Cliff's remarks and exchange is recorded. You can check it on our YouTube channel. It will go far and wide. And contact us at our website. And Cliff, do you have any contact information regarding the book or your own work that you might want to tell our audience?
I don't like to promote Jeff Bezos' company for obvious reasons. So I would urge people, if they want to read the book, to go online to haymarketbooks.org or .com. I think it's .org. But anyway, Haymarket Books website, and search for the book, either under my name or under the name The Tragedy of American Science. Thanks for letting me get the plug in.
Thanks, Cliff. I wish you success on the book and stay safe in New York City. It's still dangerous there. My best, and we'll call it a day.